the most bizarre execution methods used by ancient monarchs. Monarchs, after all, had too much power, too much time, and far too many grudges. And when you combine that with fragile egos, you don't always get great legislation. Sometimes you just get a very elaborate death sentence. Let's ease in with the Persians. King Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, was not exactly known for subtlety. At one point, he ordered that a corrupt judge be flayed alive, which is unpleasant enough. But naturally, Cambyses decided to make it symbolic. He had the judge's skin stretched across the judge's chair, so the next poor man appointed would literally sit on justice. Nothing says, do your job properly, quite like being seated on your predecessor's former epidermis. Drifting gently westward, let's linger on the Assyrians, who had a long tradition of inventing creative punishments. One of their favorite techniques was impalement, and while that's grim, it became almost ceremonial. Victims were carefully raised up on long poles as warnings to the city. For us, it reads like something out of a nightmare. For them, it was a public art installation with a very clear message: don't cross the king. And of course, Egypt had its moments. Pharaohs generally preferred exile or forced labor, but some stories suggest more exotic forms of execution. There's a tale of Ptolemy VIII, known not so affectionately as Physcon, which means potbelly because yes, even in antiquity rulers were nicknamed after their body shape. He supposedly enjoyed drowning enemies in vats of wine, which sounds extravagant, but probably smelled much worse than you're imagining. Naturally, the Romans had to one-up everyone. They didn't just want punishment, they wanted entertainment. Nero, who was essentially a man-child with an empire, turned executions into theater. Prisoners were dressed as mythological figures and the strangest, and dispatched in ways that matched the stories. Someone might be made to play Icarus, shoved off a platform with wax wings only to plummet into the arena. Or Orpheus, set among animals who were very much not enchanted by music. It wasn't justice, it was mythological performance art, paid for by the imperial treasury. And while we're drifting through Rome, it's impossible not to mention their obsession with crucifixion. It was slow, it was public, and it was designed less for killing and more for humiliating. Kings and emperors didn't invent it, but they certainly perfected its use. For hours, sometimes days, a condemned man became a kind of human billboard for imperial authority. The fact that Rome considered this routine tells you everything about how normalized cruelty was. Let's float north for a moment, to medieval Europe, where kings and queens inherited not just crowns, but centuries of insecurity. Take Charles the Bold of Burgundy. He had a penchant for military bravado, but he also liked dramatic justice. Rebels, for instance, could expect to be drowned in pig's blood, which was both symbolic and spectacularly impractical. England had its own flair. Henry VIII, because of course it's Henry VIII, experimented with boiling as an official punishment. Not for cooking dinner, but for treason. Victims were lowered into vats of hot liquid, sometimes water, sometimes oil, sometimes wine, which is a very expensive way of saying, don't betray me. But Henry, never known for moderation, thought it sent the right message. In France, the guillotine eventually standardized things, but before that, execution was a kind of royal improv theater. Louis XI liked cages, iron ones, barely big enough to sit in. Prisoners weren't killed immediately. Instead, they just slowly wasted away, suspended above the court, as a reminder of his generosity, which is one way of saying, I could have. We killed you quickly, but instead I built you furniture. Drifting further east again, the Ottomans had their own refinements. They preferred strangulation with silk cords for members of the royal family. Silk, because it was considered cleaner and more dignified than rope. Imagine that. The empire's noblest courtesy was making sure your strangulation matched the drapery. And then, of course, there's the classic bizarre execution method attributed to some Indian and Persian rulers, being trampled by elephants. It sounds almost mythical, but it was very real and even somewhat practical. Elephants could be trained to kill slowly or mercifully quickly, depending on the royal mood, which means somewhere in history, a king likely stood pondering, quick stomp or slow stomp, while the condemned man waited beneath an elephant's foot. If we step back, what all these examples reveal is less about cruelty and more about vanity. Monarchs didn't just want someone dead, they wanted it their way. Flayed skins on chairs, boiling vats, mythological stage plays. It wasn't efficiency they sought, it was spectacle. symbolism, and the reassurance that everyone in the room understood who held the power. And perhaps that's why these stories feel so oddly dreamlike now. They're not just brutal, they're surreal. We're used to rulers cutting ribbons at ceremonies, not choreographing executions as though they were operas. But for most of history, kings and queens weren't just heads of state, they were directors of very grim theater. So, as you settle deeper into the pillows, remember, while most of us end our day worrying about emails or laundry, monarchs of the past sometimes ended theirs by debating whether treason should be punished with fire, water, or the helpful cooperation of a trained elephant. Different times, different problems. And with that thought, let's drift quietly onward. Now, where were we? Ah yes, monarchs. Their endless ability to turn the fairly simple task of ending someone's life into a kind of over-elaborate art project. Take, for example, the Chinese emperors. Some dynasties became famous, or infamous, for a punishment known as lingqi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. Now, that phrase is poetic, but the reality was, well, let's just say it was not fast. A condemned person was cut repeatedly in a ceremonial fashion, with the idea that each slice represented the gradual dismantling of their honor, their crime, and finally, their body. It was less about death, which could have been achieved in minutes, and more about making an example. Because of course, if you're going to rule an empire of millions, you want to make sure one man's punishment is a kind of outdoor theater for all. And naturally, because bureaucracy infects everything, even executions got codified. By the Ming Dynasty, there were legal manuals specifying how many cuts should be made for each offense, which means somewhere, an official clerk had to write out in neat brushstrokes that treason equaled 1,000 slices, while theft might be slightly less. Imagine your whole career reduced to calculating slices. Sliding back toward the Mediterranean, let's pause on Byzantine emperors. They had an unusual habit, blinding their rivals instead of killing them. It sounds merciful at first. After all, the victim survived. But the point wasn't kindness, it was politics. In Byzantium, emperors were supposed to be divinely radiant, almost godlike. And what better way to disqualify someone from rulership than to ruin their face? By blinding, mutilating, or even giving them an unflattering haircut. Yes, really, they made rivals unsuitable to sit on the throne. Picture a man stripped of his crown because his new haircut made him look a bit too much like a disgruntled monk. That was Byzantine logic. The Middle East had its own flair for ceremonial executions. In some Persian courts, there were reports of molten metal being poured into the condemned person's throat. Gold or silver, depending on the wealth involved. The symbolism was clear. Greed had led you here, so now you would choke on wealth itself. Of course, the practical downside is obvious. Gold doesn't melt in a friendly way, which means someone had to take the time to set up a furnace, pour the metal, and hope the timing lined up correctly. All this just to send a message that, honestly, a strongly worded letter might have covered. But perhaps the oddest punishments are the ones that drift closer to ritual than justice. In ancient India, one method described involved binding the condemned beneath a cartwheel, turning them into a kind of living axle decoration until the weight of the turning crushed them. The message: don't get in the way of the wheel of fate, which sounds poetic if you're not the one serving as fate's temporary speed bump. And since we're slowly wandering through Asia, we shouldn't forget Japan. The samurai class practiced seppuku, a form of ritual suicide, where the condemned opened his own abdomen, often followed by beheading at the hands of a second. Now, calling this an execution is debatable, but when imposed by a daimyo or shogun, it became less voluntary. The irony here is that this method was meant to preserve honor. But as you might imagine, not everyone faced with such an option probably felt terribly honored. Of course, monarchs weren't only interested in killing enemies. Sometimes they just wanted creativity. Ivan the Terrible of Russia had a repertoire of unusual techniques. He enjoyed, if that's the right word, using bears to maul enemies, which, to be fair, sounds very Russian. If you picture a man in a fur hat calmly sipping vodka while a trained bear removes a traitor, you're not far off from how Ivan imagined his ideal afternoon. But Ivan was also practical. He liked boiling water, fire, or freezing. Russia provides all three. In fact, some accounts describe victims being doused in cold water outdoors in the dead of winter, slowly turning into statues of ice. Ivan, as usual, leaned toward efficiency. Why invent something new when the climate will do the job for free? If all this feels grim, remember, we're floating through history in a very dreamlike way. None of these people are around anymore. Their elaborate executions are just oddities written on parchment and carved into stone. And speaking of stone, let's pause on Carthage. Their kings were rumored to have practiced child sacrifice to the god Baal Hammon. Now, whether this was exaggerated by their Roman enemies is still debated, but archaeological evidence does suggest some form of ritual killings. The point, of course, wasn't justice or punishment, it was devotion, which is, if nothing else, a reminder that sometimes the bizarre part isn't the method, but the justification. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, the Holy Roman Empire gave us perhaps one of the strangest entries: the breaking wheel. A condemned man was tied across a wagon wheel, and bones were smashed methodically with iron rods. He would then be left displayed, sometimes for days, sometimes longer, as the wheel stood high above the crowd. Again, it wasn't efficiency, it was theater. The message wasn't just, "Don't rebel," it was, "Look, even physics is on my side." In England, things occasionally got creative in ways that sound almost childish. One story tells of Edward II, who was supposedly murdered with a red-hot poker inserted in a place best left unnamed, so as not to leave visible marks. Historians still debate whether this happened or was later propaganda, but either way the rumor stuck, which means Edward's legacy is less about governance and more about imaginative assassination, not exactly the kind of royal reputation you'd want carved on your tombstone. But even here, the irony lingers. Monarchs poured effort into making executions symbolic, memorable, or dramatic. Yet centuries later, all that survives is the absurdity. We don't remember their fiscal reforms. We don't remember their trade treaties. We remember that King so-and-so once drowned someone in wine, or sat a judge on a chair made of skin, which says less about them and more about us. Our brains, it seems, love the surreal more than the practical. So as we drift further, maybe you notice the pattern. Every monarch, from Persia to France, from China to Russia, added their own twist. None of it was efficient. All of it was theatrical, and perhaps that's the point. For them, executions weren't just punishment. They were stagecraft. They were politics performed in blood, silk, wine, or iron. And yet, lying here now, centuries later, it all feels oddly quiet. Strange rituals drifting on the edge of memory, the kind of details that don't keep you awake, but ease you gently into that place between waking and sleep. So let's drift onward to the next royal fiasco. We've wandered through Russia, Byzantium, Carthage, and England, and you might be wondering if anyone in power ever just kept things simple. Well, not really. Simplicity is for commoners. Monarchs needed spectacle. Take Nero, the Roman emperor who, like every Roman emperor, was both loved and hated, depending on who was holding the quill. Nero had a taste for creativity and death. He famously ordered Christians to be coated in pitch, tied to stakes, and set alight to serve as garden torches during his nighttime parties. Imagine wandering into the imperial palace gardens after dusk, only to find your light source screaming. The neighbors probably complained, but in Nero's Rome, being a nuisance wasn't really frowned upon. And then there's Caligula, Rome's poster child for unrestrained ego. Caligula once ordered a section of his audience to be thrown into the arena to feed wild animals, not because they were guilty of anything, but because the supply of criminals had run out and the show couldn't pause for intermission. In his mind, problem solved. In the audience's mind, perhaps less so. The Romans also came up with something called poena cullei, the punishment for parricide or killing one's father. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a snake, a rooster, and a monkey. Then the sack was tossed into a river. This wasn't just punishment, it was philosophy. Romans believed that killing your father was an offense against nature itself. So naturally, they created a punishment that made the victim live out chaos, scratching, hissing, flapping, biting, all before drowning together in one writhing sack. The symbolism is fascinating. The practicality, questionable. Imagine being the poor executioner tasked with stuffing a monkey into a bag without losing an eye. Moving east again, let's drift to India, where some medieval rulers practiced elephant executions. The elephant was trained either to crush the victim swiftly with a foot, or, if the king was in a more theatrical mood, to prolong the death by slowly dismembering the condemned. It was a clear display of both justice and royal control. Because if you can command an elephant to carry out your punishments, what else might you command? At the very least, it made sure no one doubted the power hierarchy. King, elephant, then everybody else. And speaking of animals, ancient Assyria often used lions. Captured enemies could be tossed into a lion pit for the entertainment of the court. Again, efficiency wasn't the point. This was about dramatizing the king's power over both man and beast. A lion devouring your rival made an excellent message. Resist the king, and you're no better than prey. The Persians also seemed to enjoy combining torture with symbolism. One particularly grim method, known from later sources, was scaphism. The condemned was forced into a hollowed-out log, smeared with honey and milk, and left exposed to the sun and insects. Over days, they were slowly eaten alive by bugs, the ema. Jerry was clear. Decay, corruption, and punishment blended into one sticky mess. Though honestly, at that point, exile might have sent the same message with fewer bees. Meanwhile, the French kings developed their own specialties. Take the infamous breaking on the wheel, which became so associated with French justice that it earned the nickname the French wheel. Victims were tied to the wheel, bones shattered methodically with iron bars, and sometimes, mercifully, finished off with a final blow to the chest. It wasn't quick. But the important thing was that everyone saw, because in royal France, executions weren't private affairs. They were pageantry. And what better way to remind peasants of their place than to gather them in the town square and display shattered bones as if they were part of a parade float? And yet, sometimes, the bizarre execution wasn't about cruelty at all, but about symbolism. In the Ottoman Empire, for instance, royal brothers were often executed by strangulation with a silk cord. Why silk? Because spilling royal blood was taboo. Silk was soft, refined, and elegant. If you absolutely had to kill a prince, at least you could do it fashionably. Now, if you think silk cords were strange, let's drift back to medieval Scotland, where some traitors were executed by being drowned in barrels of ale. Again, symbolism mattered. Ale was the lifeblood of the community. To drown in it was to be suffocated by the very drink that gave others joy. Whether this made executions more or less intimidating is debatable, but at the very least, it was memorable. In Spain, during the Inquisition, creative punishments flourished under the banner of justice. One method included the garrote, a chair fitted with an iron collar that slowly strangled the condemned when the screw was turned. It was slower than hanging, more controlled, and therefore more civilized, or at least. That's what the officials told themselves as they cranked the handle. And drifting further into odd territory, let's not forget the Mongols. Genghis Khan and his successors had a peculiar rule. They preferred not to spill noble blood, which meant executions had to be imaginative. Nobles might be smothered under carpets, suffocated quietly without a drop of blood spilled. To outsiders, this might have looked merciful. To those under the carpet, probably less so. Of course, the irony is that all these elaborate methods, bags of animals, elephants, silk cords, ended with the same result: death. Monarchs went to extraordinary lengths to make sure their punishments were remembered, yet here we are, centuries later, drifting through them like dream fragments. What was once terrifying is now just curious. The sting has gone, leaving only the oddity. And perhaps that's why these stories endure. They are too strange to vanish. A sack with a monkey, a wheel breaking bones, a prince strangled by silk. They linger because they remind us of how humans, when given too much power, will turn even punishment into a kind of art project. So let's keep floating, calmly, into a few more. In medieval Denmark, one king allegedly had a noble executed by being sewn into a freshly slaughtered horse's carcass. The symbolism was agricultural, returning the traitor to the animal world. It was, if nothing else, extremely messy. In Arabia, some rulers reportedly buried condemned men up to their necks in sand, leaving them to the sun. Again, less efficient than a sword stroke, but far more theatrical. Anyone passing by could see the head protruding like a strange crop planted by justice itself. And perhaps most peculiar of all, in certain small European states, executions sometimes involved public humiliation first, parading the condemned around on donkeys, dressed in ridiculous costumes, before the actual killing, because apparently, dying wasn't quite enough punishment. You also had to look foolish on the way. The thread that binds them all is the same. Execution was never just about ending life, it was performance. A monarch's way of saying, I am powerful enough to decide how you leave this world, and creative enough to make it memorable. And as we lie here now, centuries removed, their creativity feels less terrifying than surreal, like details from a dream, half remembered in the morning,